Imagine an empty warehouse. In the middle is a weighing scale, and on the scale is a stone with a small label attached. The label says, "Too heavy for God to lift." Now the awkward question. Can an all-powerful God create that stone? If yes, there is something God cannot lift. If no, there is something God cannot create. Either way, unlimited power appears to have developed a small but serious leak. This is the omnipotence paradox, usually called the paradox of the stone. And the most common philosophical answer is that God could not create such a stone. But this would not count as a limit on divine power. That sounds suspiciously convenient. So we should inspect it before allowing anyone to quietly remove the stone from the warehouse. The paradox depends on what all-powerful means. In everyday speech, it sounds simple. An all-powerful being can do anything, no exceptions. Mountains, galaxies, weather, perhaps assembling furniture correctly on the first attempt. But the word anything hides a problem. Does anything include contradictions? Could an all-powerful being create a square circle? Could it make 2 + 2 = 5, while 2 still means 2, plus still means addition, and 5 continues being rather pleased with itself at the far end of the equation? Could it create a merry bachelor who is married and unmarried in exactly the same sense at exactly the same time? These do not seem like extremely difficult jobs. They seem like descriptions that cancel themselves. A square circle is not a rare shape requiring advanced equipment. Square means it has straight sides and corners. Circle means it does not. Combining the words "does not" produce a mysterious object. It produces instructions that attack each other. This gives us the most common definition of omnipotence. An omnipotent being can bring about every logically possible state of affairs. Logical possibility means that the description contains no contradiction. A purple mountain is logically possible, even if none exists. A mountain that is entirely purple and entirely not purple in the same respect is not. Under this definition, the stone question is already in trouble. The requested object is a stone that cannot be lifted by a being capable of lifting every liftable thing. Its identity depends on defeating the very power we began by assuming. It is like asking for a lock that cannot be opened by someone who can open every possible lock. If the lock is possible, that person can open it. If the lock cannot possibly be opened by that person, then we have changed the original description of the person. We have not discovered an especially sturdy lock. We have pushed 2 definitions into the same cupboard and listened to the handles rattle. If you enjoy bad drawings doing suspiciously careful work, subscribe before the cupboard becomes a formal system. This response is often associated with Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argued that contradictions do not fall within the scope of omnipotence, because they do not describe things that can be done. On this view, it is more accurate to say the contradiction cannot be done than to say God lacks the power to do it. That distinction matters. Suppose I cannot lift a refrigerator. The refrigerator exists, lifting it is a coherent action, and someone stronger could do it. My failure reveals a limit in me, along with some regrettable decisions about upper body exercise. But if I cannot draw a 4-sided triangle, there is no coherent task waiting for a more muscular artist. Once it has 4 sides, it is not a triangle. The failure is in the request. So the traditional answer is no. God cannot create a stone, and essentially omnipotent God cannot lift. But this no is treated differently from being unable to lift an ordinary heavy object. Still, an objection remains. If God must obey logic, does that make logic more powerful than God? Not necessarily. Logic need not be imagined as a stern official standing above the universe with a clipboard. The point is not that contradictions are forbidden by an outside authority. The point is that a contradiction fails to describe one definite outcome. Consider the command, make the door completely open and completely not open at the same moment in the same way. What result are we requesting? An open door fails. A closed door fails. A half-open door fails with admirable moderation. Calling the command difficult does not solve the problem. It is closer to giving someone directions that say, turn entirely left and entirely right, than blaming their driving ability. The stone paradox is especially slippery because it is self-referential. It does not merely ask God to create something large. It asks God to create something defined by God's inability to affect it. The stone points back at its maker. A similar problem appears if we imagine a machine that can print every printable sentence. Then we ask it to print a sentence this machine cannot print. If it prints the sentence describes itself incorrectly. If it cannot print it, then perhaps we have found a sentence outside its power. The instruction uses the machine's own supposed completeness to construct an exception. Self-reference does not always create a paradox. This sentence contains 5 words. That is self-referential and also false, but it is not causing any structural damage. The trouble begins when self-reference is combined with negation, completeness, or a claim about absolutely everything. The stone does all 3. It refers to God's power, negates that power in one case, and places the result inside a definition of unlimited power. But not everyone accepts the logically possible definition. A more radical view says that genuine omnipotence must include the power to override logic itself. René Descartes is sometimes interpreted as placing even necessary truths under God's power, although scholars disagree about exactly how far his position goes. On this stronger view, perhaps God can create the unliftable stone and lift it. Perhaps both statements can be true. That preserves unrestricted power, but it creates a larger problem. If contradictions can simply be true, ordinary reasoning stops working. We can no longer infer that failing to lift the stone shows weakness, because God might both fail and not fail. The paradox disappears, but so does the logical ladder used to climb into it. This answer may express divine mystery, but it does not give us a concept we can analyze with normal argument. Once contradictions are allowed without restriction, yes and no can sit together quite comfortably, like 2 people who have accidentally been assigned the same seat and have decided not to discuss it. There is also a third approach. Instead of defining omnipotence as the ability to do literally anything, philosophers may define it as maximal power. An omnipotent being has as much power as it is possible for any being to have. No other being could exceed it. This sounds modest, but it becomes technical very quickly. Power depends on time, circumstances, intentions, and how an action is described. For example, could an omnipotent being give up its omnipotence? If it can, then it might create an ordinary stone, surrender its power, and later be unable to lift the stone. The creation and the failure happen at different times. The paradox is avoided, but the being is no longer permanently omnipotent. If omnipotence is essential to the being, then losing it is impossible. An essentially omnipotent God could no more become non-omnipotent than a triangle could become four-sided while remaining a triangle. Someone might reply that being unable to surrender power is itself a limitation. But defenders of essential omnipotence distinguish powers from defects. A perfectly reliable calculator cannot deliberately produce the wrong answer while remaining perfectly reliable. That does not make it worse at calculation. The inability follows from its excellence. Traditional theology often makes a similar argument about God being unable to lie, sin, or fail. These are described not as impressive abilities missing from God's collection, but as breakdowns in knowledge, goodness, or agency. Of course, critics can reject that description. They may argue that a being unable to choose evil lacks a kind of freedom. Or they may suspect that omnipotence keeps being carefully redefined whenever a problem approaches. That is a fair philosophical concern. Definitions should clarify a concept, not protect it with emergency padding. But the opposite mistake is also common. We should not demand that unlimited power include meaningless combinations of words, then treat the resulting confusion as a discovery about reality. The stone paradox does not prove that God exists. It also does not, by itself, prove that God does not exist. What it tests is whether a particular definition of omnipotence is coherent. If omnipotence means the ability to make every sentence true, including contradictions, then the concept escapes the paradox by escaping ordinary logic. If it means the ability to bring about everything logically possible, then the unliftable stone is not an exception. It is an impossible description. If it means maximal possible power, then the discussion shifts toward what powers are genuine, which limitations count as defects, and whether unlimited power can be lost. So we can return to the warehouse. The scale is still there. The stone is still there. But now the label looks different. Too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift was never really a measurement of the stone. It was a contradiction disguised as a product specification. The puzzle feels physical because it gives us a boulder to stare at, but the real weight is carried by the words all-powerful, possible, and cannot. The heaviest object in the warehouse was not the stone. It was the sentence folded around it.